Welcome everyone. I'm Councillor Matthew Winnington, Cabinet Member for Health, Wellbeing and Social Care and the co-chair of the Portsmouth Health and Wellbeing Board. Limited public seating has been made available. However, this meeting is also being webcast to allow the public to attend remotely if they so wish. Please be advised this public seating area is not in view of the camera to webcast this meeting. And I don't think we've got anyone in today. Okay, that's great. So if the continuous fire alarm sounds, please evacuate the room and public gallery by the stairwells. Do not attempt to use the lifts. Please assemble by Queen Victoria's statue in Guildhall Square. In order to comply with the Guildhall Trust Fire Marshal regulations, anyone who signed in at the Guildhall reception desk should sign out when leaving the building at the end of today's meeting. May I draw everyone's attention to the fact that the meeting will be live streamed. Everyone speaking via a microphone will be on camera, including those making deputations. Members of the press and public are also permitted to record the meeting on the understanding that it neither disrupts the meeting nor records those stating explicitly they do not wish to be recorded. Please can everyone use the microphones. You can bend them towards you, it's very handily, he tells me here. And remember to switch them off when they're finished speaking. And it's the button at the bottom of the thing, or the side, I think, for most of you. And don't hold it down, just press it, it will turn it on, and then press it again to turn it off. So we will just make some introductions. So we will start on my left.
Anna Martin, Democratic Services.
Matt Gummerson, Public Health Intelligence.
Simon Cooper, Portsmouth Place NHS.
Mike Stoneman, Deputy Director, Education.
Helen Atkinson, Director of Public Health, Portsmouth.
Hayden Jones, Children's Services.
Gerald Van Jansen, Leader of the Council.
Susie Horton, Cabinet Member for Children, Families and Education.
Andy Biddle, Director of Adult Social Care, Portsmouth City Council.
Charlie Pericross, Adult Social Care, Portsmouth City Council.
I'm Councillor Scott Pater Harrison. I'll be giving a deputation on item 6, and I'm also giving a written one from Councillor Weems because he cannot attend.
Terry Norton, Deputy Police and Crime Commissioner for Hampshire and the Isle of Wight.
Councillor Lewis Gosling, the Conservative rep on the board.
Paul Markham, Hampshire Constabulary, Portsmouth District Commander.
Kirsty Ranford, Director of Student Support and Progression at City of Portsmouth College.
Lorna Reevely, Chief Officer of the Hive Portsmouth.
Diane Sherlock, Chief Officer of AGK Portsmouth.
Roger Batterbury, Chairperson Health Watch Portsmouth.
David Williams, Chief Executive, Portsmouth City Council.
David Goosey, Chair of the Portsmouth Safeguarding Adults Board.
Yinka Adeniran, Councillor for Charles King's Ward.
Thank you very much, everyone. As Scott has mentioned, he has a deputation request, which I have. Scott, if it's okay, if we do that just before item 6, rather than now, and then it's just when we've got that there, so that's perfect. Apologies for absence.
Dr Linda Colley, Sarah Beattie from the Probation Service, Sarah Daly, represented by Hayden Gins, Penny Emmerich from QA, Professor Anita Franklin from the University of Portsmouth, James Hill from Housing, Kelly Nash, Paul Riddell from the Hants Fire and Rescue, and Susanna Rosenberg and Alistair Snell from the Solent NHS Trust, and then also Councillor Brian Madgwick.
Thank you very much. And for members in the room, do you have any declarations of interest? I have none either. Okay, so we move on to agenda item 3, which is minutes of the previous meeting held on the 23rd of November 2022. Minutes are there in front of you and being circulated. Were there any comments on the minutes and or matters arising that anyone wants to raise? can't see anyone indicating, so take those minutes as read and adopt them. Everyone happy with that? Excellent, thank you very much. So, on to item 4. Over to David for the Portsmouth Adult Safeguarding Board update.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for this opportunity to present the annual report for Portsmouth Safeguarding Adult Board and for your continued oversight of this area of activity, holding us to account for the work. The report, as you'll see, is dated April 21 to March 2022, which is almost a year ago. It seems like old history in a sense, so apologies for that. It was clear to us at the tail end of 2020-2021 that we needed a new strategy for the board, and we spent some of the 21-22 year doing the work on developing a new strategy. New strategies normally are heralded by words like ambitious and fundamental and bold, but I think COVID-19 made us much more practical, and so we set out a one-year plan, but with some important principles, I hope, at the heart of it. And the most important of those principles was about putting at the heart of the work the service user's voice. Those adults at risk of harm in Portsmouth. And we wanted to ensure that those frontline practitioners in all of the agencies that make up the board continue to hold those service users at the heart of their work. In that sense, I think that is ambitious. And we wanted to extend the reach of the board to service users whose voices have hitherto not normally been heard by statutory organisations. So in that sense, we established during the year an engagement subgroup, and that work has been, or that group has been beavering away, exploring those members of the public who could well have amongst them adults at risk of harm, and inviting them into the work of the board. By the end of March 2022, that work had really only just begun. Next year, I hope to be able to report to you on much more significant progress. We also wanted to look into hearing the voices of some particular groups of adults at risk, notably homeless people, those adults who misuse drugs and alcohol. And we heard through a commissioned piece of work some really important activities from Alcohol Change UK, who delivered some very key training to a number of agencies that are represented on the board. We had 2 safeguarding adult reviews published in the year, one for a youngish mum who sadly died by suicide in a hotel in Portsmouth, and the other by an older woman who died in a care home. And it's interesting, I think, that for both of those people, we hadn't properly, or the agencies hadn't properly captured their voices, or the voices of the carers of those people around them. So that reinforces our desire, I think, to put the service user's voice and their experience at the heart of what we're doing. I think during the year in question and subsequently, the need for the board to be much more bold, if I can put it that way, to champion those service users' voices is still critical. And so I commend the report to you and to seek your continued support and scrutiny to hold the board to account for its work. And if I might add a very small postscript, a little more funding would also be very helpful.
Thank you very much, David. Any comments or questions? Diane.
Thank you, Chair. David, I thought despite its age, this is a great report, and I think its transparency and honesty is to be commended. And I found it very emotional reading through it, partly because I employ the granddaughter of one of the people in the case studies. But I did wonder on page 25 or 11 of your report, where the pie charts are shown, is voluntary sector support in amongst that, or has it now become a standalone? I know we're doing a lot more work together, so I was not judging this in any way, other than wondering where we were in that, because of course as a sector we hold an enormous amount of information about people, and I just wondered about the progression and where we were today. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's a really important point, and part of our engagement subgroup work is to not only bring in individuals and groups, but organisations. And so I think we've got some very important work to do just what you've just described, actually.
Andy.
Thank you, Chair. And thanks to David for bringing the report. I'd agree with the comments. I think it's really important that we have a level of scrutiny and accountability for the work that's done in the city, particularly the work of strategic bodies that's overseeing what happens on the front line. I think whilst David made a slightly tongue-in-cheek allusion to the funding issue, that is something we're going to have to tackle this year. We had a safeguarding peer review in the calendar year of 2022 through the LGA and ADAS. It was a great review. It was done in a spirit of appreciative inquiry with a lot of people with a lot of experience in safeguarding. And they did conclude that for Portsmouth there is an issue about funding of board activity. It's something that's on our executive group today, I think it is, and it's something that's on our next board to discuss. But we are comparing ourselves against other boards. We are struggling in terms of the resources that we allocate, comparing ourselves both against other safeguarding adult boards in Hampshire and the Isle of Wight and regionally, and against children's partnerships. And that limits what we can achieve as a board. So it's just really to help the Health and Wellbeing Board understand that this is a live piece of work that we need to do, and it's likely to be difficult given the pressure on all of our budgets at the moment. Thank you.
David.
Thank you. I just wanted to lend support really to David's determination to ensure that the voice of those with lived experience is heard more at boards like that. It's something that I've been talking to the chief execs across the Hampshire local authorities about as well, particularly in relation to the emergent integrated care partnership. But also it's come up at the Integrated Care Board as well. And I think finding the most appropriate ways to do that is a really important challenge for us all. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Any other? Oh, yes, Jo.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to echo the comments really, but I think when you look at the case studies, what comes through is that although we pride ourselves on partnership working and integration in the city, what we see in both of those case studies is when that doesn't work, the output can be really quite horrendous for those families. So I think, and I take the point about the funding, and again echo the way you're trying to bring the patient's, the person's voice into that. Is there more we need to do at the front line to work with our teams to really get them to understand the need for, I think professional curiosity comes across in the report, and that need to work together. And I just wondered if that's an area that the board is also looking at.
I think the emphasis on the frontline experience of the practitioner is something that we're really keen to continue to do some work on. But if I might depart from that point, it strikes me that we also need to do some work at different levels in the system, particularly perhaps at a leadership level. I've said this during the peer review this year, rather than the one in question, that whilst in Portsmouth the integration of services is heralded as a really important and very promising set of activities, I do wonder sometimes whether we privilege cohesion amongst practitioners, amongst agencies over some other types of voices. And so in a sense I'm slightly arguing for the opposite of integration, and that is to hear different voices. Sometimes they will be discordant. Sometimes that will generate conflict. But my concern, I think, is, or my emphasis here is that sometimes conflict is our best friend. It tells us things that we might not ordinarily know. So I think there's also another agenda here, I think, about, if I might put it this way, just the slight downside of that integration.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Any other comments? Thank you so much for the report. And as you say, it's from a year ago, and obviously we've had updates since then on various bits of safeguarding, including, of course, our safeguarding conference that happened last year, which was absolutely fantastic, which I attended with others. I think I absolutely take your point, and I think one of the things that's working in the voluntary and community sector in the city, and also obviously being involved with the Health and Wellbeing Board and then other bits, and obviously right around the council and with outside partners, is that we have to get to the point of making safeguarding everyone's business. And I think that's what came out very strongly from the health wellbeing. Came out from the safeguarding conference we did, and that was very. And speaking to people afterwards, that was a really key thing. But also making people think that bringing up a safeguarding concern is nothing to be, oh, I'm not sure whether it is or not. Well, just do it, just raise it. But also, as I know I've talked to Andy about this, and within our social care team, but also with colleagues out and around, is that getting people in the community raising those safeguarding issues when they and understanding what it means and everything. And I think, as speaking as a city councillor, I think we do have a real responsibility as the 42 councillors here at the city council to take a lead on that as well within our communities. So something that I know has been a struggle in the past is getting all the councillors to sign up to their safeguarding training. But I can emphasise how important doing safeguarding training is, because we have involvement with lots of people in lots of different scenarios, and we need to be making sure we're setting that example of raising concerns at that time. So I think, and for all of us on the board, in whatever capacity we're here, I think that's also something we can do within our organisations and within the wider community. So that's something I've certainly taken away in the last year or so. Terry.
Yeah, just to come in, sorry, on a point you jogged my memory really there. I know that the force have a real focus on that key developmental age between 18 and 24 when it comes to safeguarding. They appreciate that that's probably a transitional stage in many areas where you go from all of that wraparound that happens in school and college and education into adult safeguarding. And I guess there's some work to be done there around that key developmental age. From a policing perspective, the force tell us that it's an age where people's habits are often the threat to themselves, where they're taking drugs or experimenting with various things, and they're trying to get into those kind of spaces where people of that age are. But I do think there's some work to be done around looking at what other agencies do around that transitional period, looking at is it a handover, a straight, if you're 17 years of age, then we're going to kind of put your application on hold because soon you're going to be 18 and it'll be a different agency, or is there a smooth transition? So it would be good to hear or learn from other agencies and what they, in terms of what they do around that key. I think it's a real key developmental age, 18 to 24. Is there a stall in getting people involved or engaged in that adult service if they've been accessing it through their younger years, and what can we do in terms of sharing good practice? The police have a view on it. I'm not sure if others do.
Thank you, Terry. I think certainly the transition the transition stage has been something that's come up consistently with through David. I don't know, David, did you want to make any comments about that?
We have, during the year in question, actually developed a new policy on transitions for young people into adulthood. And I think it's quite a forward-looking policy, and there have been a number of requests from other areas to make use of that policy. But you're right to point out this area as one of the key ones for us to continue to have some oversight over. It strikes me that in Portsmouth and in lots of other places too, there are some groups of young people moving into adulthood who are served really well. Those with significant disabilities, for example, are normally served very, very well by both social care and health services. But there are other groups of young people who society doesn't look at in the very same way. Those young people who are 15, 16, 17 and have a career with the police, as it were, and maybe have had difficulties with school, and those are the ones that we don't tend to look on in the same kind of way. And so it seems to me that when we're thinking about those young adults who are moving into different systems, and where there is that complete lack of wraparound by the time they get to 18, we've also got to confront some really important societal attitudes, I suspect. And possibly even shift some resources in a different way. Policies are great. It's the practice on the ground that makes the difference, isn't it?
Thanks, David. Thanks for everyone's contribution on this, and thank you again, David, and your team for the report. Is everyone happy to accept that? Brilliant. Okay, thank you very much. So on to item number 5, which is the Preventing Violent Extremism Strategy. So Andy and Charlie, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity just to update on the Preventing Violent Extremism Strategy, also known as the Prevent Strategy. So we've got one recommendation today, and that's to support the continuation of Prevent delivery at current levels to meet the local authorities' obligations under the Counter-Terrorism and Security Act. I won't go into too much depth in the report, but I might say a couple of things about the headlines. So in terms of the background, we just provided a little bit of background around Prevent. So it's the prevention part of the Counter-Terrorism Strategy called Contest. And there's an obligation on specified authorities, the local authority being one, to have a due regard to the need to prevent people from being drawn into terrorism. So it was a legal obligation from 2015. There are 10 local authority delivery benchmarks in place now, and that's a new development in the last couple of years. So it varies from having a risk assessment to a Prevent Partnership Board to an agreed partnership plan and a channel panel in place. So the channel panel is the case management side of Prevent, and that meets every month in Portsmouth and any other local authority area. And we had a Home Office assessment last year, so it deemed Prevent operational delivery in Portsmouth and channel practice to be strong, with aspects highlighted as good practice, and it particularly noted our multi-agency board that operates on a quarterly basis. So at the moment we're just revising our training and communication and community engagement plans. There is now also an annual assurance statement that we need to provide to the Home Office along with the channel, the case management side of Prevent, and that looks at a number of documents, an action plan, situational risk assessment, venue hire, to make sure that there's no extremist speakers that would seek to book within our venues in the city, and a communication and an engagement strategy as well. So we provide updates to the Home Office on those particular documents. The Office project, so the Office project was our EU project that we managed to secure external funding for, so that's been for the last 3.5 years. So we've received 60% of the funding from the EU, and the local authority provided 40% of the funding. So that ceased in December this year. And we've just provided some statistics around the Office project. And also, I've just provided a little bit of information around the current arrangements in Portsmouth, the makeup of our delivery board, the staffing, and also the support that we provide to educational establishments through our dedicated education officer, John Webster, who sends out regular bulletins to schools, higher education, further education, and provides a great deal of training to schools in particular. And I briefly mentioned the channel process, and again, we meet on a monthly basis, and the Home Office did note that is extremely well represented across different statutory agencies in terms of trying to support vulnerable people that are referred into that scheme. And lastly, I've just mentioned our counter-terrorism local profile. So that provides a risk assessment to us, and that informs our action plan going forward. There's currently been the independent review of Prevent that's looking at different risks and different priorities across, nationally, but that's not really going to impact hugely on our risk assessment that we have to put in place locally in Portsmouth. So we will look at the implications of the independent review of Prevent, but we do have our own regional and city action plan and risk assessment that's conducted by counter-terrorism police. And I think that's it. So we've provided just some legal comments at the end in terms of the statutory duties, some of the finance aspects of it, but I'm really happy to take any questions if anybody has any on Prevent or anything else in general. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Any questions or comments? I'll just have one for you, Charlie. So obviously you mentioned about the Orpheus funding ran out at the end of last year. Have we got any replacement funding that's come into instead of that?
I'll hand over to Andy, but we're seeking external funding opportunities at the moment. However, the EU funding that we accessed before is not available to us any longer, so we are looking at other external sources, but nothing at a late stage at the moment.
Thanks, Charlie. Thanks, Chair. Yeah, as is so often the case with adult social care, we take something over and then become the voice of doom around money. So what we've done at the moment is we've enabled this work to continue because the Orpheus cash ran out in December 22. I don't think anyone would disagree. It's fundamental work and it contributes to keeping the city safe. We've had initial discussions internally within the council in October of last year around how we try and put this funding on a more permanent basis. And we're seeing, I think what the report reflects to me is we're seeing layers added since the original duties came in, and we're not entirely sure what the independent review will result in, but we suspect there'll be further work that needs to be done. So the resources that we have are essential to keep that going. We are also looking internally as to whether we have any support we can offer from existing resources. But at the moment, I think it's fair to say we don't have a specified source of funding as it stands at the moment. We do think we may see some income and some residual grant monies. We're probably not going to know that until next month at the very earliest, I think, and that would make a contribution rather than cover that off. So we have a risk where it comes to money. We're working hard. We're also looking at income that we can bring in. The arrangements in Portsmouth are very strong, and I think for the Home Office to acknowledge that gives us that very positive message. But we've got some work to do, I think it's fair to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Gerald.
Thank you. My understanding from the government was that all EU funding that was lost was going to be replaced by the UK Shared Prosperity Fund. Presumably we just write to them and say, can you send us a cheque, because that's what you said and that's what you need to do.
We can certainly try that. I'm not sure I'd have faith in that. I take your point, Gerald. One of our options is to also say, look, government, we've got this really strong process in place, we've got this really strong partnership in place, but we have an issue with money. We didn't want to rely on that.
Well, maybe we need to write to the MP for Portsmouth North for her help in trying to make sure the government sticks to its word.
We can certainly do that.
There are, of course, £350 million a day extra available to the government because we're no longer in the EU. So there'll be masses of money to be able to pay for this.
Thank you, Gerald. I might agree with you. Just one other thing as well. It says obviously we had the really close working with other parts, our partners abroad as well. And obviously that's come up with some really positive outcomes. Despite everything else, are we keeping those contacts going in terms of sort of moving forwards, even if it's just on a correspondence basis?
Yeah, there's a legacy aspect to the project. So we've got a webinar on Thursday, and we're also they're shared training products as well. So actually, there is an aspect where we've still got those engagement with similar cities. That's the reason why we had a partnership in the first place. It was a 2Cs project, so coastal cities in Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. So just geographically, there are some similar characteristics of Portsmouth and Calais, for example. So, yeah, we do continue to communicate. Thanks.
Brilliant. David?
Yeah, I mean, without venturing into the murky politics of this one, which is quite extensive, I mean, we've had a number of, let's call them engagements with the Home Office over this agenda over the years, which Charlie will remember well. I guess my message is that whilst, signals at the moment might be good, whilst there's a debate going on, raging one might say, between the attention to the far right and the attention to so-called Muslim extremism, I just think it's really important that we don't deplete our resources and our attention and become complacent about this issue. I think it's really important. I welcome this report to keep it on our agenda, and I think that we should be pressing for opportunities to fund this, both the very soft side of this and some of the sharper end side of this, wherever we can find that opportunity, and clearly working with our partners across the city, very obviously with our colleagues in the police, the university, but also more broadly. It was one of the things that came through, I thought, quite strongly when we did the work around city vision and city values. I think it's really important that we don't just let things slip away because they're no longer quite so high up in terms of the media profile. And that's really what my advice to this board would be. Thank you.
Excuse me. Thank you, David. And I think it very much in a side of it really fits into what we were just talking about in terms of safeguarding as well, because obviously this is about making sure that we're looking out for people in our city and about working together and having everyone involved in that kind of thing. So thank you very much for that. And thank you. Oh, Charlie, yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to add, just to highlight David's point, with the risk, that the Home Office are moving towards addressing the Islamist risk to the greatest degree, and that was essentially the same position back in 2009. But within Portsmouth, we've been very cautious that we want to deliver this in a proportionate way, and that we're sensitive to the feelings of our communities in Portsmouth. So that's been an overriding kind of characteristic of our approach in Prevent. So we don't want to stigmatise, we don't want to feel like communities are targeted by this agenda. So that's just been a golden thread throughout our work within Prevent. So I just really wanted to highlight that and build on what David mentioned.
Thanks, Charlie. And yeah, and I think that's a really important part of how our city works, is that we're looking at all of those sides of extremism rather than looking at any particular one. And we know obviously that extremism comes in very many different forms and has very many different aspects that can obviously do a lot of harm to people. And also, of course, it targets a lot of very vulnerable people. And so thank you so much for the report. That's been really, really helpful. Is everyone happy for that to be adopted and noted? Thank you very much. So item number 6 is the pharmaceutical needs assessment. So Scott, over to you to do your deputation and to read out Daniel's.
I'll read Daniel's first, if that's okay.
That's fine.
It's just, obviously, Daniel has put his words down, so I'll read them verbatim, so apologies. I would like to address the issue of pharmaceutical services in our city with a specific focus on the Hillsey area. As you all know, pharmacies are an essential part of our healthcare system, providing access to vital medicines and advice for patients. However, many areas in our city, including Hillsey, are facing a shortage of pharmacies, which can have a significant impact on the health and well-being of the local community. In Hillsey, there is currently only one pharmacy, Rowlands, which is serving the entire area, which can be a major inconvenience for residents, particularly those who are elderly or have mobility issues. Furthermore, with the pandemic, the demand for pharmacy services has increased significantly, putting more pressure on already limited resources. I think it's crucial that we address this issue and work to improve access to pharmaceutical services in Hillsey and across the city. This can be achieved through a range of measures, including creating a pilot for a community pharmacist to prescribe, and most notably allowing local and national providers to take over the existing Rowlands practice. I urge the board to take action on this matter and collaborate with local healthcare providers, policymakers, community groups to improve pharmaceutical services in Hillsey and beyond, and by doing so we can ensure that all members of our community have access to the essential medicines and support they need to maintain their health and well-being. Okay, that's Councillor Weems. It's very elegant, much more so than I will be. Bear with me. So your report today states the current P&A was published in October 22, and it stated that further loss of pharmacy provision in the city were likely to create a gap. I recognise that your report today states this can take a more streamlined approach, creating a local process that provides that response, and I do welcome those steps, and I welcome the approach you're taking because it seems a bit more logical and sensible. As stated by Councillor Weems, in Hillsey we only have one pharmacy, and while it's not in your report yet, that we have been informed that the Rowlands plan to close the pharmacy on London Road and merge it with the Kingston branch. And if you look in Appendix 1, the closure of Rowland Pharmacy on London Road will create a geographical gap in the community. It would also mean that there's no pharmacy provision in the ward moving forward. I've completed a rough estimate, and it would impact over 2,000 people. There are a large number of older residents in sheltered and retirement accommodation in the area for whom the distance is already to alternative provision is too far, and that would represent a reduction in provision for them. And after speaking to residents last week and over the weekend with colleagues, residents are concerned, they're worried, they're anxious about how they will receive their medication if it's allowed to go ahead. And that's one of the reasons Councillor Weems isn't here, because he's torn a ligament in his foot because he was door knocking with me at the weekend, so apologies. I personally believe that this merger cannot and should not be allowed to happen. It would be a disaster for Hillsey Ward and leave no provision covering a vast majority of the ward, with the only provision being on Copner Road and into Anchorage Park, which is already stretched. I'm slightly jumping the gun because I know it's not in the report, but we have launched a campaign to ensure that Hillsey retains its only pharmacy provision, and I would respectfully ask this committee to use the powers it has when it comes forward via this report to ensure that this merger is not allowed to happen and provision is retained in the area. I thank you all for my time. I don't come here often, and I hope the next time I come here it's to propose that the merger doesn't happen. But thank you for your time.
Thank you, thank you, Scott. Matt, over to you.
Thank you, Chair, and I'll run through the paper. I can briefly just respond to the concerns that Councillor Peter Harris has raised and reassure him that the process that we're setting out in the paper, if agreed by this board and the revised P&A, would absolutely mean that if and when we receive notification for consolidation for that pharmacy, which, as you're aware, we haven't officially received yet, the view of the Health Wellbeing Board, I believe, would be that we would oppose that. And we've received reassurance from NHS England that if that's what our P&A says and that's the view of the board, then their decision would be to oppose those closures too. So it won't prevent the closure going ahead because pharmacies can still choose to close, but it would mean that another provider could choose to open in that area. So hopefully that should provide some reassurance. However, the wider issues around community pharmacy are going to be picked up by Simon after we've done the P&A reports, because the potential closure in Rowlands is one of several that may happen, as well as the ones that are covered in the report. So in terms of the P&A itself, as you'll be aware, we published a P&A, you approved a P&A and published it in October last year for the next 3 years. But because of the timings of the closure around the Elm Grove pharmacy, in order to now identify that as a gap, which this board made clear it wishes to do, we now need to produce a new pharmaceutical needs assessment. So what we're aiming to do is have that ready to start the statutory 60-day consultation by the end of February, and we're asking the chairs can have permission to sign off that draft for publication on behalf of the board. It will come back to this board at the end of the consultation period for final approval. We're also asking to consider a change to how we respond to consolidation applications. It used to be a 45-day period for the Health Wellbeing Board to submit its response to any consolidation applications received. That's now been reduced to 30 days. So we're trying to agree a more streamlined process, which I think, again, with the greater clarity that we now have about what the Health and Wellbeing Board response will be, should will hopefully be acceptable to you. So Section 3 of the report describes this in a bit more detail. It includes the fact that, as well as the Elm Grove pharmacy and I should mention the Eastney Road pharmacy, which we didn't oppose, and I think we just accepted that there were two pharmacies very near to each other, so it was a reasonable consolidation. There's additional closures that have happened since then with the Drayton Community Pharmacy and the Lloyd's Pharmacy in Sainsbury's and Farlington. So that's the kind of bigger challenge around community pharmacy that we'll talk about separate to the P&A, because the P&A is kind of limited as a tool in terms of what it can do around those kind of issues, but we'll try and make sure that it doesn't in any way prevent the response that we'd want to those. I can reassure the board that we won't have to do a revised P&A in light of future consolidations, so it's just about the timing of when this one was received around when our P&A was approved. In future, we can, because we'll state clearly in the P&A that further closures will create a gap in our view, then we will oppose consolidations and they should be rejected. If the closure then goes ahead, it will create a gap. And if closures happen rather than consolidations, that automatically creates a gap in the view of NHS England. So we can just do a supplementary statement in future saying this pharmacy has now closed, therefore there's a gap, rather than having to go through this process, hopefully. But for now, we'll be specifying the gaps, because that's how we have to do it, around the 3 confirmed closures set out in section 4.2. And Appendix 1 describes that in a bit more detail in terms of the rationale for those. What we're proposing is that we don't update the bulk of the P&A because it was approved fairly recently, so all of the population health analysis, etc., will remain the same. So we'll just update those sections that we need to update in order to identify those gaps and for it to make sense. But we'll still, so in the new P&A, the conclusion will be, we believe that there are gaps created, as set out in section 4.2, around these 3 pharmacies that have closed. We also still believe that any further closures will, on top of those, will create a gap, and that will mean that further closures will not be, the P&A will not prevent new services opening to replace any further closures. Let's say section 5 sets out the proposed change around the process. You agreed a previous process back in 2017. So with that reduced time, it's going to be really difficult from when we receive a notification to then produce some analysis about what the response should be, send it round to all members of the Health Wellbeing Board, consolidate a response and get it back to NHS England within 30 days. Given that the Health Wellbeing Board response to almost any consolidation applications now will be to oppose them. I think looking at the map, there's a cluster of pharmacies in Cosham High Street where I think we would struggle to object to saying that one of those closing would create a gap when there's several others in the High Street. But other than that and the 2 that are very near to each other in Fratton North End area, all others would be considered a gap. So if you're happy, we'll approve those by the joint chairs in line with what's in the P&A.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Matt. Any comments, questions? Susie.
Thank you, Chair. This board will know that I've got keen interest in this because of my strong objections to the predictable situation of the merger of Elm Grove with Osborne Road. But I know that's not exactly what it's about, and it is about this revised P&A, and I think it's very sensible, and I agree with everything that Matt has said, particularly around the streamlining of it. And I think, Councillor Peter Harris is here putting forward all of the things that I put forward about the potential for it, and what we need to do is create systems where, as a board, we can minimise that. Because what I want to emphasise, if I can indulge myself slightly, is the human element of this. So I predicted some really strong things that I felt would happen to my family, and all of those and more came true. In fact, some people in this room got an email from me, I think just before Christmas, whilst I was in a queue with 17 people in front of me, trying to get some medication for my mother, which it was a serious situation. And that was the culmination of 16 hours worth of members of my family trying to sort something out for that week. And that was because her local pharmacy, Elm Grove, was closed, which removed all her independence and also the relationships with those pharmacists, which could have led to a really dangerous situation. So we've actually changed pharmacy now, and it is a lot better. I'm not going to do any name checks, but I mean, I just want to emphasise that all of the things that we talk about, I know we're on the same page in this room, but actual live situations, people desperate for medication, and just the inefficiencies of it all, creating potentially serious situations, but also just removing people's independence to care for themselves is a crucial thing. And as Andy always tells me, the big thing about adult social care is about maintaining independence. So it's a little bit of I told you so, although no one was disagreeing with me. But if we can create any system that will make that far more efficient, I absolutely get that pharmacies can choose to shut. We're not in control of that. But if we can consolidate that period of time where we can respond to that gap, it is better for all our residents in this city. Thank you.
Thank you, Susie. Lewis.
Thank you. Just kind of actually following on from Susie's point, we've spoken before on this board, and actually I think it was the leader of the council that raised what's happening with why are we not getting more prescribers on board, why are we not taking this forward in other options. So I've done a little bit of digging into this, and actually it's been confirmed in Parliament now 3 times in the last year that the power for this sits within the ICB. So the ICB have been given the power to launch a trial for prescribers. The government are training 6,000 over the next 2 years. As we know, from 2026, all new pharmacists will have the training to be able to do it. So as a board, what are we doing to get this work happening? We've sat in this room time and time again about pharmacies closing, about the difficulties. Councillor Horton mentioned she's raised this numerous times, and yet actually to see that there is the power there to be able to do that. As a board, what are we doing to chase this up? What are we doing to really put a stamp on that?
So I think with the, I think this is where Simon's going to come in and talk about those wider issues. And I see his lights on already. So yeah, so he can tell you what it is that has been going on, and of course this was originally raised at the first GP summits back in August, and I think there's a presentation.
There will be a presentation in a second.
But over to you.
But to answer that specific point, there are expressions of interest by the end of February to actually enter into their pathfinders for prescribing within pharmacy. It isn't specifically community pharmacists prescribing necessarily, but it is prescribing from pharmacies. And as of last week, we've had very positive discussions with the LPC in terms of taking Portsmouth forward as one of those pilots, and we are taking that forward as part of the ICB. Whether there'll be other bids as part of the other ICB or not, but we will be taking that forward in terms of that. And
Simon, what's an LPC or LPA?
Local Pharmacy Committee.
Okay, it's nothing to do with Liverpool Football Club.
Whether they support them or not, I couldn't tell you.
Okay. It'd just be helpful to know what initials actually mean in real English.
If I slip into NHS acronyms, then hold me to account. So we've got the support from the local pharmacy committee, we've got the support from the ICB, and prior to becoming the ICB, checking if that's okay, we have...
I get them mixed up with the ICBMs.
No, different thing. One has more power than the other, but I won't tell you which. We've also managed to gain funding for 7 specialist pharmacists within Portsmouth who will be prescribers. They're coming on board. They will be working within my team across all practices, and one of the potential uses of those could be prescribing from community pharmacies. We just need to caveat that prescriber, just because you're a prescriber doesn't mean you will prescribe everything. It needs to be within your competencies, and this is an area that will grow over time, and I'm really sure that it will grow over time, but it will be a slow and gradual evolution as we see things change in community pharmacy.
Thank you, Simon. I'm just going to come in before Gerald. I just to go back to Scott's and Daniel's representations, and thank you so much for your deputations today. As the South Sea ward, which has the big chunk of people who don't live within 10 minutes walk of a community pharmacy, I, in the same way as Hillsea obviously does, and a lot of places elsewhere in the city, I think it is. And we have in our boundary we have one pharmacy. Yes, we have another one over the roads in Susie's ward, but that's right at the other end of the ward. It really does make that difference, and you can see the threat that it might make sense even on a geographical basis, because they're not that far from each other, but actually because of their catchment goes a lot further as well. So I think that point is well received, and as we've discussed before, as Susie's pointed out, and it's something that we've taken a really strong point of view on. I think it was really frustrating as well that these regulations changed just as we did our last pharmaceutical needs assessment. So this is why we're doing it again. And if these had been in place when we did our last pharmaceutical needs assessment, then we would not have had to have gone through this through this process again to do this, and we could have been much more robust in our objections at the time. But we are where we are, and I think we're in a really good place to show that A, there are gaps, and B, that every community pharmacy we've got now is really key to go forwards. So I'm just going to bring Gerald in quickly, and then we'll pass back to Simon, and then we'll have any more discussion on this, and then I will ask about us adopting the pharmaceutical needs assessment and going forward to the out for consultation. So, Gerald.
So I think the report's sensible and right. I just wish we had got here earlier, because the problems caused in Elm Grove by that closure are very significant. I know it's not our decision, but NHS England, I think, would be charitably described as pathetic in their responses. Hopefully we can give them some level of backbone by having this new PNA, so that they can oppose things. I'm really worried what's happening up in Drayton and Farlington, having lost 2 up there as well, which looks very, very concerning. I think it is good that we will now say that enough is enough, and there can be no more closures. I'm concerned from what Matt is saying that there will be people coming forward and with closures, and the power, as I understand it, is that the NHS have the ability, which they've exercised, to say to people, you can close and we will make sure there's no competition to you by not allowing a new pharmacy into the area. I've always thought that was wrong, but I'm glad we won't be in that position again. I think there are 2 things. I think, picking up what Lewis said, I think I would look for an initial recommendation that we go out to actively work with local pharmacy providers to see what we can do in terms of filling gaps, and making sure that we do have provision across the area. I think we're lucky in some ways having a local provider, and many areas don't have a local provider, and they're all national chains, and to work with them to see where we can get to. I think though we also need to reflect that the reason for closures is because pharmacies are becoming uneconomic. The new pharmacy contract came out in 2017-18, was a cut of £200 million off the pharmacy's budget, and it wasn't, and it runs till 2024, and there is no inflation provision within it. So we now know we've got inflation running at 10, 11%, and yet it's a cash limited sum. So every year, the ability of that money buys less and less. So now it's down to just 3/4 of the real value that it was in 17-18, and it'll continue to fall, which will cause more and more closures. So I think we do need to reflect and regret the cut in government funding for pharmacies since 17-18, and that is the root cause of this problem.
Thank you, Gerald. Joe, and then we'll go on to Simon.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. Thank you, Gerald. Just to respond to some of that, I think the ICB, as has been mentioned previously, ICBs took on delegated responsibility for pharmacy, optometry and dental services from NHS England in July 2022. I think that's a really positive step because it means we can understand the impact on that locally and across the system. It does mean we're rapidly trying to get up to speed with what all of that means. So I think we probably need to just better understand the national contract around pharmacy. I'm not sure some of the figures you've quoted, necessarily, Gerald, I would recognise, but probably need to go back and double check on that. So happy to do that and can provide an update to the board if that would be helpful. We know that all of the contracts in that grouping are being reviewed currently through NHS England at a national level. So absolutely we do need to influence upwards, and I would really support your idea around how we work with local pharmacists more closely. We've seen that we can have some impact on that, doing that with dentists. We know it works with GPs, so we need to continue that approach. And I think what Simon's presentation will do is just explain some of the more detail around why some of this has happened, because I don't think it's just in relation to the new contract, although that or the national contract, although that will obviously have an impact.
That's fine. And Simon, you said that there were murmurings of other places that might close. What are those murmurings? Because the longer we have to campaign to keep things open, the more chance it is we'll persuade people. And exactly the same as colleagues are doing in Hilsea, if there are others at risk, we need to know.
So I'll touch on this when I go through why I think it's going in that direction. There are no specifics necessarily, and I'm not naming any names in terms of where I think there may be, but actually you can see a direction from what I'm going to present in a minute.
And then it's about how we, both the ICB but also working in partnership in place, can influence that and make a difference and acknowledge what we might see, but how we're going to get the best for our residents as we always try and do.
I was getting slightly worried I was going to be doing this via the medium of modern dance at some point. for risk of everybody. So, as I've introduced myself previously, I'm Simon Cooper, I'm Director of Medicines Optimisation within Portsmouth. But what might be interesting for the board to know was that in '88 I qualified from Portsmouth School of Pharmacy, about 30 yards away from here. And for the first 9-10 years of my career I was a community pharmacist, of which a lot of that time was spent in and around Portsmouth. The irony of which that one of those branches is no longer around isn't lost on me, but I don't think I can be blamed necessarily on that. It was a long time ago. Modern dance may yet be coming in. Right, I'll try not to touch it. So the brief was to try and describe some of the ongoing issues and effectively the sit rep of community pharmacy as it sits and how that affects Portsmouth. So, as is very apparent, we are seeing mergers and closures across the board within Portsmouth over the period of time, and I suspect we could probably add some other issues on here over the time in terms of mergers and closures. That is not unique to Portsmouth. That is a national issue, as Gerald has alluded to. And if you look at recent closures nationally, and you look at the number of items that those pharmacies do, and an item is a count of the number of different drugs on a prescription. So whilst it's not the be-all and end-all, it gives you a measure of footfall into that pharmacy. You can see, if you take the median of that and apply that to pharmacies within Portsmouth, we've got about 10-11 pharmacies at or below that median. That doesn't mean they are going to close. It doesn't mean that they are those that are most likely to close, but it's indicative of where we are currently across the whole wider spectrum in community pharmacies, that actually we might start to see some more rationalisation, and that may continue going forward. Some of that, I suspect, could be directly taken back to 2017 and the contract changes. Whether that's a direct or an unintended consequences of, I think that's probably still up for debate. So one of the main issues, as we've seen, and we discussed this briefly in terms of the GP summit that we've had recently, the first and the second one is workforce. Workforce is no different within community pharmacy as it is within GP practices. We are seeing a workforce being spread thinner. We're seeing them being used in GP practices to great benefit, but that then obviously reduces the workforce going into community pharmacy. And community pharmacy isn't seen as the sexy, exciting piece currently that perhaps specialist hospital pharmacists or the pharmacists that I've recruited recently, specialist pharmacists to work in areas such as cardiovascular or mental health supporting practices, again isn't seen as that. Perhaps the bid for the Pathfinder sites can start to re-engage that as another area for excitement and direct patient care. But at the minute, this isn't necessarily where your undergraduates are aiming their careers to go into.
Can I just ask, when you said Lloyd's in the previous slide, us wanting to sell all their high street pharmacies, does that mean all the ones outside of supermarkets?
So they have offered their pharmacies for sale. At this point, it's unclear whether they've offered all of them, but they are open to approaches. We don't know whether this covers their online service either.
But when it means high street, does that mean the one on Highland Road?
So this is bricks and mortar pharmacies. Whether that specific one has been offered, we don't know. But they are offering to other contractors to consider selling on their pharmacies as going businesses.
But again, we don't really have the detail.
We are seeing rates for employment starting to skyrocket as well, which means that actually trying to maintain a pharmacy, if you're running on locums, is becoming less and less financially viable. And some of the salaries that I've been seen quoted for a pharmacy manager is starting to make it almost attractive for me to go back into community pharmacy, which I suspect is the last thing that patient support would want, is me turning up as a pharmacist. So what we are seeing is an increase in use in online and distance selling pharmacies. So it's probably surprising to see that across the ICB of the whole, pharmacy contractor, so Pharmacy to You in Leeds is the highest dispenser of the ICB of any place. So you could, from that point of view, consider Pharmacy to You in Leeds as a strategic site for pharmacies from the ICB. We have a distance selling pharmacy within Portsmouth, within Victory Internet Pharmacy, but because online and distance selling pharmacies do not have a front door, it may as well be on the moon. So talking back to what we've heard articulated further, that relationship with your pharmacy, that front door where you can walk through the door and get your self-care medicines, where you can get your advice, patients are choosing to split that service. They are choosing to go to online services for their regular repeat prescriptions, and regularly quoted 70 to 80% of prescriptions are regular repeat prescriptions. The patient knows what's happening with those medications, is happy that they can deal with those medications, know what to do if something changes. So why wouldn't you want that to come through your door on a regular basis without having to go and collect a piece of paper and potentially move it to somewhere else? The unintended consequences of that, obviously, is that we're not seeing the growth in high street pharmacies that we are with online distance selling pharmacies. So although our GPs are writing more prescriptions, we're seeing that increase being swallowed up by online pharmacies. Glasses down. So from that point of view, they are great, they are convenient for patients, they get delivered, which isn't a contractual obligation for a high street pharmacy. So an online pharmacy has to deliver back to the patient. It matches fantastically with things, so regular repeat prescriptions and something called electronic repeat dispensing, where the GP authorises and effectively pre-signs your next prescriptions up to a year in advance. You don't have to request them. It just arrives at your door. You'll get a phone call from the online pharmacy saying, do you still want your regular repeat? Are you happy with it? You want everything that's on the prescription. That then triggers the next dispensing, so it comes to you. So you can see how this would be particularly useful for patients on regular meds. So that easy, low-hanging fruit that you can get through your business to maintain those more difficult, challenging patients is starting to go elsewhere. What those online pharmacies can't do is they can't do that walk-in services, the self-care. Although they might be selling online medication, it's not something where you're going to go in and necessarily choose or take advice from. It's a bit more difficult. So if we start to see an increase of online distance selling pharmacies that then starts to make our high street pharmacies less viable, we start to lose the unintended consequences, as Susie described. You start to lose that relationship. And you can describe a future scenario where patients get their prescribed medication on a box through their letterbox once every couple of months. They get their self-care from supermarket or garage forecourt. Other than that, it's back to the GP. And there are a tranche of medicines, the licensed as P medicines, that are only available to be sold within community pharmacies, which are the ideal group of medicines for self-care and step down from GP care. But if patients are taking that access to that pool unknowingly from their armoury, then self-care takes a hit. So what is surprising is the age group that are using online pharmacies. And we see by percentage of patients using these services actually increase, and it kicks up at around 80 years of age. Now, this was a surprise to me when I pulled this chart off to look at it. And I think the only way I can describe this is at that point is when you start to look after your parents, or you have somebody looking after them. And it's not necessarily the 80-year-old that's going online and registering with Pharmacy to You, but it's the 55-year-old son that lives 60 miles away, asking for a friend, from their parents, and sorts out the medication, so it comes in regularly and it arrives on their doorstep. We also need to take into account that care homes will be using distance selling pharmacies as well, but it's exactly the same principle. It's somebody is looking after that person's medicine, but you can see where it's taking up. And I could only describe that triangle at the 80-year-old starting to move to the left of these take on. So we'll start to see that happening earlier and earlier. So just finally, there's a couple of slides. Before you fall over, I'm not going to explain this slide or talk to you, but it is deliberately busy. So this is now the processes by which you can get a prescription. This is not a case of walking to the doctor, saying you have an issue, him writing out on a piece of green paper your prescription, you taking that to a pharmacy. Those days are long gone. And there are a variety of ways by which you can actually get a prescription to a patient. What is interesting is that the green arrow is the most efficient way of getting that prescription, and that aligns perfectly with online pharmacies. The blue arrow is for an acute prescription, which doesn't fit with an online pharmacy. So if you have a twisted ankle from door knocking, for example, and need a short prescription of analgesics, if your nominated pharmacy is in Leeds, then you won't be in on Friday because you're still waiting for your medication to arrive from Leeds. So we need to actually, as patients evolve in their use of pharmacy services, we need to work with them to describe the best way to tiptoe through what is a very busy slide, to make sure that if they do go to online services, they aren't throwing away the baby with the bathwater in terms of when they do need something urgently, they find that it's no longer there for them. So that's me done. I'm sure there are some questions to come out. People seem to be enthralled by pharmacy services because I think everybody can relate to it and understand it.
I think,
Jay.
Matt, yeah, just to add to that, thank you, Simon. I think, that those slides paint the sort of reality of the challenges that we're facing, and I think it's something that, as we've worked with GPs and we've increased electronic repeat dispensing, there have been unintended consequences of other policies, and again, pharmacy being commissioned in a different way probably has meant we weren't really sure that that was what was going to happen. So I think what Simon's presented is the realistic challenges that we face as an ICB, and along with other colleagues in the region, NHS England, we're now looking at this and trying to understand what is our strategy? How are we going to manage this? What are the opportunities in this? How do we work differently? We all recognise the role that pharmacists have in supporting the wider health system and supporting self-care and those lower interventions. And actually, there's much more that people could see a pharmacist for. But how will we bridge that gap if there's no community pharmacy? And they're the sorts of things we're starting to look at. I think the challenge for us locally in Portsmouth is again, because of levels of deprivation and issues, the impact of the cost of living crisis on the city as a whole, we're going to see the challenges of this first, and perhaps other areas will follow from us. So it's not a good place necessarily for us to be first in, but I think that's the reality of where we are. So we really need to think about not just the strategy, but what's our operational and tactical solutions that will start to impact quickly to resolve some of the issues in Drayton and Hilsey, for example.
Thank you. Simon, can I just ask you to switch off your... thank you very much. Lewis and then Helen.
Thank you. Just a quick one, actually, on the points that Joe's raised there. One of the big takeaways from the second GP summit for me, actually, was and I'm really sorry, I can't remember the lady's name, that come from the community pharmacy group, who actually saw a lot of what we've just described as negatives as major positives for their industry, and actually they've been shouting for years of they can do so much more. They are so much more than someone just to fill your prescription for you. And we all know that prevention is the best cure, and it's something that actually trying to bang into NHS colleagues sometimes can be difficult on, because there's always that person at the front door that is presenting, whereas we try and look much more strategically, and actually having those plans in place for being able to really support that strong community pharmacy base and what they can do for the city. And you've quite mentioned the deprivation and stuff like that. There is a massive need for that in this city, and it's something that we have really got the tools on, I believe, to be leading on.
Thank you. Yeah, and I would agree with you. I think there are always opportunities in, the phrase "don't waste a good crisis and see what you can get from it" is probably really true in this instance. I think the other thing we need to recognise is they are all independent contractors and independent businesses, and there have been inherent perverse incentives between GP practices and pharmacists working together in the past. Flu vaccination is a case in point. We need to work out how we can resolve some of those issues and help and work together to look at, how do we take the opportunities? How do we get pharmacists to really do or play the huge role that they're capable of playing in supporting the wider primary care system? So that's some of the work Simon and I are trying to think about. How do we do with colleagues and with our, local community pharmacists and GP practices as well.
Helen.
It's actually the same point, but I will still say it if that's okay. And I'm saying this in support of Simon and Joe, not to, because they know very well, and we talked about this. It is the same point. What really concerns me is it's some of our most vulnerable residents, as you say, that use community pharmacies and are often the first point of call for those communities. So we commission community pharmacies and to deliver to our substance misusers directly observed morphine. We also, as well as we've talked about our older residents, how dependent they are on pharmacies, but we also provide quite a lot of our preventative services, like stop smoking services. They were, apart from obviously the, St James's, the, first part of call during COVID for people. So I think it's stressing the point more, and this is in support. This is not to give Joe and Simon a hard time. That's why it's so important that now the commissioning is now with ICB colleagues and being led by Simon. We have such opportunity to connect it into the work that we're already doing, that we've already got concerns about. GPs, dentists. I think it's important that we are looking at all of this service and looking at opportunities. Now it's local because we've got that local knowledge, and so just really stressing the same point.
Thank you. Did you want to come back on that one, Simon?
Yeah, I think what's interesting, and Helen sort of reminded me, is that historically we have commissioned pharmacies to provide prescriptions. And as we see patients using it in a different way, what we need to start to consider is what we do actually commission from our pharmacies, because I think the services that we've described that we want and we need were never actually commissioned direct from pharmacies. It was an unintended benefit of patients going and seeing their pharmacy to get a prescription. So we need to think about how we maintain the viability of those pharmacies to provide those services that we've described going forward.
Thanks. I've got Susie, Diane and Gerald.
So just a quick one, sort of ties these things together, which is I think it's going to be a real opportunity for the ICB, because it's almost like a fascinating future, because particularly I think the thing that's going to make the biggest difference is the prescribing, because it will obviously have an impact presumably on the GPs. And then what I find fascinating about the workforce is, going back to your point around actually people might then be attracted more to pharmacy working because they'd have more kind of autonomy, won't they? And so it's like, I was just thinking another example, sorry, I'm going to indulge myself here, but I was waiting for 2 hours at a pharmacy the other day for an like a pen, which we were waiting on the doctors, and in the end it took 2 days for the GP to sign off something to pick up a pen that was in front of me at the pharmacy, but they wouldn't give it to me. And I was just thinking the amount of time and effort that takes. So I think the prescribing thing will really be a game changer, and long term in terms of pharmacy profession, I think it'll be really interesting.
Diane.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to support Simon and Joe, and probably I was one of the few people not remotely surprised at the age range in your graph. I would like to let you know, from Age UK Portsmouth's perspective, our youngest client is 42. So age has definitely changed in the 10 years I've been here. We we were radical looking at 50-year-olds when I arrived. We're now working with 40-year-olds, and really we've got to be looking to late 20s and 30-year-olds to be educating. So I thought I'd just give you the heads up on that age range, as I actually had to have that discussion with the national organisation who wanted to start a particular project we were talking about, age range 50, said it wasn't young enough.
Gerald.
I think Simon's presented this as a really worrying case study, because it looks as if we will see the death of most community pharmacies over the next 10 years across the city and probably across the country. When I've been talking to pharmacy chains, they're saying that by 2024, 75% of their businesses will be loss-making, and they're not charities, so they'll close. So we're going to have a very big problem. And it seems to me the whole point of the words from government are about, in terms of strategies, about trying to support primary care, to keep people away from going to hospital and going to A&E and things like that. And yet the experience of real people is it's very difficult to see a doctor, or that's what people tell me, and it's going to become increasingly difficult to get to a pharmacy. And unless you're okay on the internet, things will become unavailable. And therefore the only options that people will have is to go to St Mary's or to go to A&E. And we're just going to be racking up pressure on the acute services, which are already collapsing. So I think the ICB is going to need to look at quite a radical change in what we do in terms of pharmacies, because it looks as if the cuts in government funding and the way in which people are choosing to access pharmacy is going to mean that most pharmacies become uneconomic. And if that's the case, then we're going to have to look at ways in which we're not relying on the private sector to do this, that we're relying on public sector pharmacies to be able to provide things for people for whom accessing it through the internet is just not a viable option. So I think we're going to have, over the next 10 years, we're going to see a complete change in the model, and that's probably going to mean, I'd have thought, either substantial subsidies or to reverse the cuts in funding to pharmacies, or the NHS having to provide them directly. So I think things are going to be very, very different. And for a lot of people in this city, where we know functional literacy is low, this is going to produce a really big problem. One of our learning points out of the expensive children's programme, or I forgot what it was. It's not expensive children. What was it? No, the one that Louis Casey used to do. Troubled families, in brackets, expensive families, was we kept writing, lots and lots of different parts of the state kept writing to people, which did no bloody use at all, because quite a lot of people couldn't read. And we were very surprised people didn't turn up for appointments when they couldn't read the letters inviting them to them. So we're going to have to do some radical thinking, because pharmacies on the high street will stop being there really quite fast.
Cheryl, I'm just going to ask Simon to wrap up now, because I'm just conscious we've still got 3 items on the agenda and 34 minutes to go. So,
and Matt, you said it was going to be a quick meeting, over in half an hour.
Well, it's pharmacies, isn't it, Gerald? Pharmacies. So, Simon, and then, as I say, we'll have to move on.
So I think, Gerald, to answer your question, yes, if we don't change. I think we need to look at what isn't currently funded of those services that we all describe that we want, and how we get those services funded. I think the historical reliance upon commissioning pharmacies just to do prescription items is probably outdated now and is not fit for purpose for the services that we want for the population for Portsmouth. And just to finish off about age, just with a very quick anecdote, one of my last structured medication reviews I did for a patient, I was considering the patient who was 92 years of age, had a hip replacement and was on a huge cocktail of drugs, and I'd already set in my mind what that patient was like until I read the line in the notes, still walks to work. The patient was 92, for crying out loud. So it is just a number, and we perhaps have to talk about people like they're individuals.
Thank you very much. I'm not going to let you in, David, I'm sorry. I think just my conclusion on this is, I think echoing a lot of what Gerald said in terms of we have to look at what's going to be there in the future, but as we're already working on this, and I think all that work that's going on is really, really critical. But just as we're doing a bit of anecdote city, one of the issues over the year is government is very slow at understanding that actually what people want is face-to-face contact with people, and whether that be, I used to work for the DWP, as many of you know, and one of the things that was done in successive governments was cutting down on face-to-face, the ability of people to have face-to-face contact, and that had a very detrimental impact, and still has to this day. And if they think that government is going to just, people are just going to go to a no physical contact, no face-to-face contact situation, then they don't understand actually what it is that people want. So and as Gerald said, if the private sector isn't going to provide that kind of service, then there's going to have to be something on a more national basis to make that happen. But I think all we can do locally is just, with all the work that is going on, that we just have to make the most of our resources that are available. So going back to the pharmaceutical needs assessment, so there are 3 recommendations which are on the paper. Is everyone happy with taking that forwards, and particularly that we can be signed off for consultation by myself and Linda as joint chairs, and also that this is a key thing, that Health and Wellbeing Board responses to future consolidation applications can be approved by the joint chairs because of the reduced time of things in future, of the response in future as part of the revised process. Is everyone happy with that?
Matt, so we did have another one which added an extra one to say that we'd proactively engage with local pharmacy providers to see if we could fill some of the gaps, and I'd like to have that added in as an extra recommendation. Okay, is everyone happy with that? Fab. Okay, thank you very much. So we move on to health and wellbeing strategy education, and I'm sorry, David.
Good morning. Mike Stoneman, Deputy Director of Education. I wanted to give you an update on the health and wellbeing strategy and the education element to it. And there were 3 areas there, one around supporting families in pregnancy and early years, another around developing a citywide culture of aspiration and expectation, and a third around developing models to promote school attendance and inclusion. And I'll give you a few highlights in terms of the progress we're making against those 3 areas. But I thought what would be helpful is to provide a bit of context first before I go into those 3 areas. I've got quite a few slides, so I will rattle through these at pace because I know we're a bit short of time. So if I just go on to the first one. Just bear with me. Okay, bit of context then. Some of you will be familiar with this, others not. In terms of the education landscape, we've got 61 state-funded schools across the city, and the important point here really is that most of our schools now are academies, so they belong to what we call multi-academy trusts. We've got 14 trusts in the city. 70% of our schools are part of those trusts, and the rest are local authority maintained schools. And as this is focusing very much on educational attainment, it's important to note that it's the academies who are the accountable bodies in terms of raising standards within those schools. Obviously, for the local authority maintained schools, we are ultimately the accountable body for that. So just making that point. Go on to the next slide. This just makes the point that we are an academised city, but what we haven't seen over the years is a step change in terms of school improvement, raising those standards. We have seen some improvements, and I'll talk a bit about those later, but clearly there is a lot more to do, and I'll show some data which reflects that. We do have strong collaborative arrangements in the city through the Portsmouth Education Partnership and also through the SEND board, and it's worth just reflecting on two very positive inspections around SEND, the local area inspections, the one we had back in 2019, and more recently we were a pilot for the new framework, which we had one in 2022, and that went pretty well as well. So on that front, very positive. I made the point that we haven't made that step change yet. We are, in terms of Ofsted judgments, most of our schools are good or better, and that certainly wasn't the case 6 or 7 years ago. So some good improvements there. But if you look at the end of Key Stage 2, which is for 11-year-olds, the end of Key Stage 4 for 16-year-olds, and I'll show some data, we have still got some way to travel. And it's for this reason that very recently Portsmouth was named as one of 12 new priority education investment areas, which puts the spotlight very much on Portsmouth. It does mean some substantial investment, which is clearly a positive thing, and we've recently been putting together a delivery plan to access some of that investment. We've been notionally allocated 1.8 million over 3 years, and we are waiting ministerial approval for that delivery plan, which focuses on 3 main areas, one around literacy, another around maths, and a third one on school attendance. We've had very positive feedback. I'm expecting the green light shortly, but still waiting for that. This is our education strategy as it currently stands. We've got 8 priorities. I won't go through all of these because I'm going to come on to the 3 that are within the health and wellbeing strategy. We will be adding a 9th, which is maths, which reflects the delivery plan we just put forward to the DFE. Right, I'll go on to the data next. It's quite sobering data, to be honest, and we've seen some improvements, but also some disappointing issues around standards. So the first one is around Key Stage 2. This is the standard which looks at reading and writing and maths combined. This is at the expected standard. And across the country, and it's pandemic related, we have seen falls in attainment from the last available published data in 2019 to the data we now have in 2022. Obviously, within that, we had the pandemic, we had teacher assessed grades, so we can only really compare with 2019. And what you'll see there is the drop, it's quite a significant drop there from where we were in 2019 to where we are now in 2022. We are the blue line. The green line is our statistical neighbours, the average there, and the red line is the national average. And what you see there is we've had a drop, similar to other areas, but that gap between ourselves and national has widened slightly. Reading is probably an exception. We've seen some improvements there, and the gap between Portsmouth and national has narrowed. And in fact, reading has been a significant focus for the city over the last 2 or 3 years. So it's really pleasing to see those improvements, and I'm sure that will continue into 2023. Writing, on the other hand, took quite a significant drop, and this was the case nationally. We are fairly confident there will be a significant improvement in 23, but it's worth just noting that drop and that increase in the gap between ourselves and national. And maths, again, we were on a trajectory of quite significant improvement in maths as a result of the work of the Solent Maths Hub in the city. But again, after the pandemic, you can see that significant fall, which is why it's one of our priorities within the delivery plan that we submitted recently to the department. If I just go on to GCSE headline figures, I won't go through this table, but I will just pick on a few graphs. So we talk about standard pass, which is grade 4 and above, and this is the standard pass for English and maths. there you can see in the blue line we have improved. So the latest data, 2022, the data for 2020 and 2021 were teacher assessed grades. The data in 2022 were based on formal examinations, so we can make a kind of a comparison with 2019, although you have to be fairly careful with this. But there we have seen an improvement, which was pleasing to see. That improvement is reflected nationally, but the gap between ourselves and national is still fairly wide. So although we've made improvements, that gap is still significant. Same goes for the strong pass in maths and English, strong being grade 5 and above. Again, you can see a significant improvement, but that gap is still there between ourselves and national. And the other important measure is what we call a Progress 8 score. If you want me to go through what Progress 8 means, I can do, but it'll probably take about 5 minutes. But suffice to say, this measures the progress between Year 6 and Year 11. And the national average is 0 effectively at the top of that graph. We're down at minus 0.35, and you can see our stat neighbour average is minus 0.11. That's quite a significant issue for us, so progress is something which we are also looking at. School attendance, just very briefly, worth just reflecting on some of these figures. I'm starting with primary here, and again we're in blue. We've seen some good improvements around attendance, particularly at primary, and we saw further improvements in 21. This is the latest published data. I'll talk a bit about 22 data in a moment. And that gap, as you can see there, is pretty much as it was previously. This looks at persistent absence, so that's where we're missing 10% or more sessions at school. And there you can see where we are there. An increase there, but similar to the levels nationally. For secondary, the situation is rather more worrying. So we're in blue at the top there for absence, overall absence, and you can see we're above national, above our stat neighbours, above the South East. And if we look at persistent absence, again, we are above all those other areas. So that is clearly an issue for us. And if we go on to quickly go on to the 22 published data, well, it's not published yet, so I'm giving you sort of early insight here. We have seen across the country falls in, we haven't seen improvements in absence, and that is pandemic related. But primary, we're still thereabouts in terms of where we were with national, but secondary, that is of concern because that gap has has widened between ourselves and national. So school attendance, a huge issue for us, and I'll come on to that in a moment. Worth also just reflecting on post-16 participation. We track and monitor the participation of 16 and 17-year-olds across the city. And we have a really good track record on that because there you can see in terms of the unknowns, the percentage of 16 to 18-year-olds that we are not clear about is fairly small compared to many other areas. And then we have the NEET figure, that's those young people who are not in education, employment or training, at 3.8%. We combine that figure with the unknown figure, which gives us a total of 5.28%. And that is above national. It is, though, slightly below our statistical neighbours. But what is worrying, and if I'd shown some trend data here, is that that number is creeping up. We were on a trajectory of improvement before the pandemic in terms of our NEET figures, but since the pandemic we have seen some small increases in the number of young people who are not in education, employment and training. So another key focus for us going forward. Right, I'm going to give you a few highlights from the strategy. And the first one deals with supporting families in pregnancy and the early years to give children the best start. And the main highlight here, which has come from Anthony Harper, who gave me a brief update, is the work we've been doing around the family hubs and the bid that we submitted to the DFE. And when I put this presentation together, we didn't have the green light for that. We now do have that green light, so that funding has been confirmed. We're one of 75 areas benefiting from this funding. And that will mean an expansion of our family hubs. You know, we have 5 at the moment in Buckland, Milton, Hilsea, Somerstown, and Paulsgrove, so an expansion of those services that we offer to families, and there you can just see some highlights in terms of what we'll be doing over the course of the next few years around family hubs. So, you know, really, really important development, and looking forward to seeing that rolled out. The next one is around developing a citywide culture of aspiration and expectation, and there have been a number of things we've been doing there. Aspirations Week, just to mention that was back in January. We've been doing that on an annual basis. Most of our schools embrace Aspirations Week, and it means an opportunity for employers to come into schools to talk about career prospects, future job opportunities, what it means to be whatever they're talking about in terms of the jobs, and that's grown from year to year, and a really important development. Our schools are really bought into that. We've also got the Youth Hub, My Future in Portsmouth, which is funded through DWP, and that is a focus for employment support, careers guidance for young people aged 18 to 25, including specialist support for our care experienced young people, and we're continuing with that. The Careers and Enterprise Apprenticeship Show, that was something which we relaunched in 2022 as a live event because of the pandemic. We've not had that since 2019. That links with over 800 young people across the city from our secondary schools and around about 40 employers, as well as post-16 providers attending that show. Really important development, that one. Last week was National Apprenticeship Week, and we've been working with a number of partners, such as Shaping Portsmouth, Stagecoach, the LEP, Servant Skills and Apprenticeship Hub, University of Portsmouth, and that is all about introducing young people to apprenticeship opportunities, and there's an apprenticeship bus that goes around our secondary schools delivering those visits and encouraging young people to think about apprenticeships. We also have a joint funded post supported by the Council and Solent LEP, which is working with our schools to support their career strategies. And we also have something called Ascend Employability and Enterprise Forum, which is about improving employment opportunities for our young people with SEND, special education needs and disabilities. And part of that has included the development of Southsea Library Cafe, giving young people work experience opportunities there. We're also developing supported internships as well, so lots of work going on around that. And the last area, which is quite significant, is around developing models to promote school attendance and inclusion. And again, I'll just go through a few highlights there. First one is around the deployment of education link coordinators. This is something we set up during the pandemic, so coordinators that worked with all of our schools, tracking and monitoring our most vulnerable children and young people, looking at their attendance and looking at how we can improve the work for them on a multi-agency basis. I should add that we've got a really strong grip on tracking children, and that's not just in terms of their attendance, but it's also on things like reduced timetables. It's also about children who are home educated, or what we call elective home education, and also tracking those children who are severely absent, so below 50%. And we've got really good systems in place monitoring and tracking those children. Building on the work of the Education Link Coordinators, this year we've been focusing very much on those children who are severely absent, below 50%. We recognise, schools can only do so much, and they're doing an extraordinary amount of work. But for those children below 50%, we know there are significant issues which go way beyond school, and it's a multi-agency approach that we need. So we are now, last year we piloted some multi-agency meetings with schools to look at this cohort. That seemed to work well, the schools liked it, and we're continuing with that arrangement for the spring and the summer term, multi-agency meetings taking place each term, looking at those severely absent children, looking to see where we can unblock barriers to make sure they are attending school. Another key strand of our attendance work is around relational practice in schools. This is around high support and high challenge, building relationships with children and young people. And we have been working with a school, Trafalgar School, which is sort of leading this work, who have embedded relational practice within their school to good effect. They've got good attendance levels there, very low levels of suspensions, or what we used to call fixed term exclusions. In fact, I think, pretty much zero now. And we're looking to try and roll that out across the city. In the first wave last year, we had 13 schools actively taking part. We've got another 22 in our second wave, and we've got £500,000 of funding backed by our Schools Forum to support that work. Continuing with developing models of inclusion and supporting school attendance, we are having those, what I call rigorous conversations with those families where we've got attendance issues, particularly around persistent absence. So this is where those children and young people have missed over 10% of school sessions. And that we hope to support through an expanded school attendance team, slightly dependent on the funding through the education investment area, but as I say, that's looking positive, so I think we can do that, and that will also include a health specialist as well, because we know that the majority of absence is health related, and it's important we have that health specialist in there as well. We've also been supporting neurodiverse children in school. This is very much around, rather than having a diagnosed-led arrangement, it's about needs-led, and we've put in place an ND multidisciplinary team and a profiling tool. Early days, but that is beginning to take effect. We've got our mental health support teams working across the city. That's full coverage across all of our schools, which also works alongside our inclusion outreach service and also the multi-agency behavioural support service, which many of our schools buy into. We've been reviewing our alternative provision, so this is the alternative curriculum for those children and young people that are struggling to access the national curriculum, how we can offer that alternative curriculum to get them back into school, get them back into learning. A lot of that is produced by schools. We also commission more specialist support through the Harbour School and Flying Bull Academy, and of course there are a range of other providers around the city offering alternative provision, and we're looking at how we can make the most of that system to support that work. School attendance campaign, Miss School, Miss Out, that was something which we launched a few years ago. We had a pause during the pandemic. We're looking to relaunch that, but in a more targeted way, building on previous campaigns and also what early years have been doing in terms of their Go to Grow campaign. And I think finally, just to mention the holiday activities and food programme, HAF, as we often refer to it as, which provides activities and healthy food during the holiday periods, so Easter, Christmas, summer. That's been really effective for our vulnerable children, those on free school meals. Yeah, it's been a brilliant development, that supported obviously by government, and we've got a few more years of rolling that out. And I think, oh no, important slide to finish up on, particularly around school attendance, is what we can collectively do to support school attendance. So schools obviously have a big role here, particularly in terms of their early help, support and challenge to families, and our schools are doing everything they can on that, supported also by the consistent use of the revised family support plan. But schools need help, and I talked about those children that are below 50%, for example, in terms of attendance. Schools can only go so far. We need everybody to collectively work on this issue. Children's social care, early help, health, whether it's health visitors, GPs, school nurses, the police, etc. Everybody, putting their effort into this to support school attendance, putting that high support, high challenge into families, making it clear how important school attendance is, because as soon as children start to miss out on school, particularly those who are persistently absent or even below 50%, then their life chances start to diminish as a result of that, and obviously harder then to access post-16 education and training beyond school. So yeah, that's my sort of last message really, and plea to look at that support that we can all provide to support school attendance. And I've probably gone over my time, but I will stop there.
Thanks very much, Mike. Any questions, comments? Terry.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, look, first of all, I'll go through these in order if I can. So first of all, I welcome the support into pregnant families. I know that the leader of the council mentioned the Troubled Families scheme, a scheme that I think if there was any that could be returned, that would be the most beneficial, because it really is needed. I know there's 300 million from the government in 75 areas. Isle of Wight was one of them. Portsmouth isn't, for their new family hub scheme, but we hope that that's extended. In terms of the school stuff that we've seen today, I mean, Mike mentioned about 6 or 7 years ago, not many schools, not the majority of schools being good or outstanding. I actually think under the previous administration it was 87% when they left in terms of good or outstanding, but that doesn't mean anything if attainment isn't where it needs to be. And certainly in my term, with a slightly different hat on as a councillor, it's just not got any better in terms of attainment. And we've heard strategy after strategy after strategy, but there is no real way of hiding the fact that children in Portsmouth are less likely to attain than if they go to school other places in the country, and that is not a very good picture. It doesn't help when we had things like the pandemic, and we were reassured by academy heads and by head teachers that their teachers weren't going to grade grab. They were going to be very act with integrity when it came to the teacher assessment, and yet we see 2 years after the pandemic, results have dropped straight back down. When retention is an issue within the city, putting pressure on teachers to boost their grades and then not be able to keep up with the bar in later years is quite clearly not a very productive thing to do. I guess this all links into behaviour, and I'm going to try and come on to the policing element there, and a big part, I think, of this is down to behaviour in schools, and we're you know, with a push for schools to deal with behaviour units in-house, it is, of course, having a knock-on effect on attainment. And I know there are examples of relational practice, which effectively is kind of deal with it yourselves in-house. And we talk about Trafalgar School, but again, great work that they're doing in terms of their inclusion, but it's not reflected in their results. So there needs to be a balance, I guess, between do we want, you know, inclusion, or do we want results? And if we're ignoring the fact that children are significantly underachieving in the city, it becomes a very, very difficult area. However, I think there is some work to be done with the police. Of course, we want the police to be doing the job that only the police can do, and where there are areas when it comes to extreme behaviours and criminality in schools, police having access to that building to be able to go in, and more schools are coming forward, certainly to me, and asking for a police presence on site, then of course we need to be able to work with them and ensure that there is an open door policy. Now, don't want to make any assumptions about closed door policies, but from certain agencies, from the police at times, we do hear that not all schools, the vast majority do, not all schools welcome that presence in because they're worried about reputational damage and various other things. So we've got to make sure that is accessible there. I don't want to overplay that one because I know it's contentious, but you know, the agencies and the police do still tell me that they struggle to get hold of people, and it's not a two-way street. In terms of the mental health support, absolutely. We wrote to, I think we did, Chair, write to the ICB to ask them to prioritise CAMS and young people's mental health. Again, from a policing perspective, with 11% of police calls coming in being around mental health, an absence of other services is putting an unwanted pressure, I think, on police forces to deal with things that, you know, others should be gripping, really. But the key thing here, I think, is around obviously that, you know, that attainment, and it doesn't seem to be getting any better.
Shall I just come? Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily disagree, actually, with what you said, Councillor Norton. I would say that I think inclusion attendance is inextricably linked to attainment, because if we don't have kids in school, clearly they're not going to attain. And that is an issue for us in the city. It has been a long-standing issue. I welcome the fact that we're a priority education investment area. It puts the spotlight on us, but I think, you know, we need some investment. And also I think we need to... we had a meeting with the regional director for the Regions Group, Kate Dethridge, and you know, made it very clear to her that we're putting that challenge into our Academy Trust to raise the bar, because, yeah, I agree with you. It's not good enough in terms of attainment and progress, and that's what we'll be doing, you know, relentlessly. And I think this investment and the focus on literacy, maths, school attendance, and some of our underperforming groups, particularly white British boys, for example, over the next 3 or 4 years, is going to be, I think, you know, really important. But yeah, I can't disagree with what you're saying.
Thanks. Susie.
Hi. Terry and I don't always see eye to eye on philosophy of education, but anyway, I'll be as respectful as I can on some of it. No, I absolutely agree about the challenge, and I think we can't avoid the challenge around standards. It is the measure that we have to live within. That schools are judged on one set of statistics which are around exam attainment, and exam results are king, and absolutely take it on the chin around why is it that we can't do as well in that game as other places who maybe have similar circumstances. That's fine. It is a conundrum. I spend a lot of time talking to Mike and Hayden about this. But I think and by the way, I don't think that Ofsted results mean nothing if you don't get attainment, because actually Ofsted look beyond exam results, and actually that for me is the most important thing. But anyway, we'll leave that one aside. So I suppose the point that I want to make is, and anyone who's heard me get on my soapbox about this, is there's different ways of getting from A to B. And if the end game is exam results, then we have to look at the journey that we take from getting from A to B. We are a poor city with challenges and massive inequalities, and I think I don't think we can use the pandemic as an excuse, but I do think we can look at some of the strategies that we had in place which were beyond the school gates, around family safeguarding, around multi-agency working, around health inequalities, and look at some of the things that were to some extent making progress at closing that gap, and then the pandemic came along. It's not an excuse, but if you're already disadvantaged, then the pandemic would have had a disproportionate impact on you. If you were at home, homeschooling, in a beautiful bedroom with 5 other acres of land around you and parents who were happy to teach you at home, you were in a better position than you were if you were stuck in a maisonette with 4 other siblings, and special educational needs and all the rest of it. So I do want to give that context, and this is the forum where I think it's going to be most understood. Absolutely agree with the things that Mike said, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but attendance is key. And it has to be a family thing. It cannot just be around the child not attending. Why is a child not in school? There has to be a reason, and we need to work collectively along that. The other theme for me is around mental health. And there's all sorts of conversation we could have about unpacking the semantics of it, the diagnosis of it, and all the rest of it. But the fact of the matter is, it's a vehicle through which we can access supporting help for families. And I think that's something that this board can take forward. The aspiration stuff is really important. I think this is where we're going to do a breakthrough on this. And we started this a few years ago by actually having a conversation around how can we lift our kids' ambitions above the horizons of Portsmouth? How can we get them to believe that they can do things? Because we know that when children believe things, when you believe you can do something, you're halfway there. And I've often used a phrase that I think Portsmouth as a city has a low self-esteem. And actually that's where we come back to the kind of mental health issues around what can we do collectively, multi-agency, instead of just criticising people and using measuring and hard tools for telling people that they should sort themselves out. How can we be part of the solution? Just as a little example, putting this together, Trafalgar School, who have led on relational practice, and I'm sorry, I do think that that is a really good example, from a school that had a high level of exclusions to having none. They've got to be doing something. Now, they're either shoving these children under the carpet or they're having some success. The fact that schools across the city are welcoming a new approach is really positive. And they were a school that stepped up, saw the Live Well events that we've been doing across the city, which are all, of course, multi-agency, and said, can we combine that with a parents' evening? And I went along to one last week and actually saw those parents engaging with other services. So I get the league table thing, and I get that we have to do our best for our children to be successful within the national system. I get that. But actually, we are a city which has a very set of complex issues. But actually, we have, I believe, the right values to sort those out. And the representations within this board are probably the best platform on which we can do that. So I think the attendance stuff is a really good bringing it back from my big picture stuff into actually what can we do. The attendance one is a really good one to focus on, and everyone in this room can actually do something to help that situation. Off soapbox.
Joe.
I'm not sure I can follow that, Susie. I wholeheartedly agree, and your passion shines through. I suppose building on that, my question, I think, is you're doing a huge amount in aspirations and careers for children, and I just wondered if, as organisations and with health and wellbeing, and the fact that between us we cover some of the biggest employers in the city, are we doing enough to really be represented at those events? And my guess is we're probably not, and I know it's something Hayden and I and Andy, we've talked about. We want to do something more, but it would be interesting to take your view, Mike, as to whether health and care is represented well enough, and whether we sell our story as being a good employer.
Yeah,
or is there more we can do?
There is some representation, but I think you're absolutely right, Joe. We could certainly do more. We've got a lot of industries there, some of our growth industries that are important, and they're the jobs of the future. But actually, when you think about where most of our employment is, it's within those services, isn't it? So, and that's where we've got lots of opportunities. So I think we are underselling ourselves a bit. Anything you and others can do to help support those sort of events, and that would be great. Yeah, and happy to put you in touch with people who can support that.
Thank you. I think that'd be great. I think you're being polite in saying we're underselling each other. I suspect we don't come across as either accessible for some of the children in the city, or as exciting as career opportunities. So we've probably got some more we can do.
Thank you. Any other comments, etc.? Susan.
Just to say that we've got a watch up about Aspirations Week. So if anyone here who wants to put forward, now they've heard me talking about why I think it's important. If anyone can offer up stuff, we can feed it back into the wash up and try and make it bigger and better next year.
Thank you. And I'd just like to add my little bit there, and I'm sure Diane would agree. With the voluntary community sector as well, which is, of course, is a big chunk of our workforce in the community. And though we do have some younger people who work in the sector, there's also a lot of people who find their way round to it eventually, whereas there's actually, for a lot of people, because it's so diverse, it might well be something that would be really good. Just on the... I completely agree on the attendance side. When I was school governor at Milton Park, primary, I stopped being a governor 9 years ago now, but there was a huge amount of work that went on. I mean, ludicrously proactive by the senior leadership team in actually going out and getting children into school. And we know how incredibly hard people work, and we know what a difference it makes when you have that kind of commitment. And it really makes a difference. And I also know from my, not in Portsmouth, but from when my mum was a teacher at a school which mainly had its catchment from an estate, a council estate in Hastings, that again the work to get children into school in the first place had the biggest impact on attainment, because, as was made out, if children are in school, you can't teach them. And it's what is so frustrating about, there's lots of things that have happened with the pandemic in lots of areas that we deal with, but I think that education generally across the country has been the biggest thing that has been such a detrimental impact, because children are our future, and the things that you've lost effectively for 2 years you can't get back. And all those things that we put in place where people got into routines were broken, and that's made it really difficult. But thank you, Mike, to you and Sarah and the rest of your team as well about the work you're doing with people in education. From everything I've seen, I think we're doing everything in the right direction, but it's a long process, and I think that's really come across in the work today that's been presented today. Just to say, we're going to drop the Superzone update from the agenda for today. We're going to bring that back at the NES Health and Wellbeing Board. It's coming to, there's also one coming to Cabinet as well. But thank you to Andrew, who sat through the whole of the meeting with Helen. But I hope it's been useful. But on to something we do have to address today, which will be our final item now, which is Combating Drugs Partnership Needs Assessment and Plan. Over to you, Alan.
Good afternoon. I'll make it as brief as I can. I think the paper details everything I was going to say. So essentially we're bringing the substance misuse plan to the Health and Wellbeing Board for approval. There's a large amount of work that's been undertaken to look at the needs assessment, and we've provided a copy of the needs assessment within the appendices. We have a requirement to have a combating drugs partnership and to undertake a needs assessment and to develop a plan for the work that we're going to do. So within the needs assessment, there are some key things that some key challenges that have been highlighted, which are detailed in the paper, but not limited to. Our substance misusers have really poor physical and mental health, but they also have very high levels of unmet need. The discussion around pharmacies was a really interesting one because we have 500 or so people on substitute prescribing who access those pharmacies for their medications, not perhaps the easiest customers. We would struggle to deliver that service without a good spread of pharmacies. Otherwise, we'd be delivering from one base, and you really wouldn't want 200 or 300 drug-using clients turning up in one place every day to get their meds. So pharmacies are really important. We've highlighted a lack of capacity and work that's required within our young people's services, and that's detailed within the needs assessment and addressed within the plan. So just to skip kind of to the end of the paper, there's 3 key priorities which we've identified within the plan. So disrupting local drug supply chains and drug-related crime, improving the quality, capacity and outcomes of our adult drug and alcohol treatment services, and reducing the harm caused to young people by drugs and alcohol. And each of those actions has a series of objectives, a priority champion who will lead that within the Combating Drugs Partnership and be accountable and hold to account officers for the work. And then there is an action plan that sits underneath each objective which details the work that we'll be doing. That will be monitored by the Combating Drugs Partnership, and there will be a performance framework with a whole raft of measures to measure our performance against each of those areas, which we intend to bring here on an annual basis for your review and so that the Health and Wellbeing Board can hold us to account. So I'm asking that you note the needs assessment and approve the plan. But just one quick caveat, the plan isn't written in stone forever. It can be adapted over time as priorities shift and needs are identified further.
Thank you. Thank you, Alan. Comments, questions? Diane.
Just very quickly, I wanted to say it was an incredible paper. Quite a read and a journey, but wow. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Diane. And I think we all echo that. And just to confirm, obviously, the Combating Drugs Partnership is a statutory organisation that exists as a sub-board of the Health and Wellbeing Board. So it comes here. And as Alan said, obviously that plan will be under review by that partnership on an ongoing basis. And obviously that will be a feed in and feed out from this board as we go forwards. But obviously that includes a wide range of partners within that, and so that will continue. So is everyone happy with those recommendations then, as stated? So we note the substance misuse needs assessment and we approve the substance misuse plan for Portsmouth 2023 to 2026. Brilliant. Thank you everyone so much. I know we've run slightly over, but really appreciate all of your time and input today. So thank you very much.